Okay, so hi everyone to the fourth address space extension working group call. Today we have a somewhat shorter call scheduled where we basically wanted to go over the content of yesterday's call again, but produce like a tangible document where we actually list the specific kind of use cases or cases in which interoperability between these different personas and all the new address spaces would be problematic. So this is kind of the topic for today. Alex, do you want to kind of lead that once more?
Yeah. First of all, I want to thank everyone for the repeated activity on joining this. I'm quite surprised that we have a similar amount of people as yesterday. And I tried to listen to some parts of yesterday's call just to be able to add some more points to the document. But I only ended up adding one, which I think is relevant to today. It's this specific discussion, I guess mentioned by Micah, that what happens for the case when a legacy contract, which is bound to only using the legacy EC recover, would recover an address different to, I guess, like different to the compressed one. And yeah, I added that as a point. And I think the other one we wanted to discuss is really this token balances with compressed addresses, and if the compressed address is a persona. I suppose our goal would be to maybe fill out these 3 points, and if there's anything else, add something else. And maybe before we get into that, maybe some of you have seen, but on the cryptography channel on the Ether Discord, Mike asked the question if anybody would have an idea how could we have a compressed short address which is still distinguishable from a regular short address. And I don't think there was any real answer so far coming up. I did propose. Sorry, Micah.
I think I was mostly convinced by POTAs that it will necessarily require a reduction in entropy, and we can achieve the same thing by just doing use the first n bytes. I think we'd functionally be the same. So I don't think there's any easy wins there.
Yeah, and on that note, I propose like a simple idea that you would just have like a hash of the remaining, or like some kind of a checksum of the remaining bits. And somewhat related to this other proposal, to instead of extending the address space, rather just using the 20 bytes, we did do some analysis on existing accounts in the state just to find any kind of prefix, and there's plenty of like 3-byte prefixes which could be used in general. But I think I realized that with even that proposal, we do have a similar problem as we have here in case of any of these like the compressed issues, that we need some kind of a recovery option.
Right. I mean, especially when it's not ETH, right? But if it's a token balance or something, then that could still be sent to like by mistake to an address with that prefix.
Yeah. I guess in that other proposal, how it works is if your regular address generated from your public key would end up with having that prefix, then you just XOR it, or you just do a next step to generate a version which doesn't have that prefix. And obviously with the for these cases, we would need some kind of recovery option. Okay, just conscious of time. So in the, I guess one point we discussed is really this question: what happens with token balances with compressed addresses? Do you wanna spend a few minutes on that?
Yeah. So maybe just to get that kicked off, just very briefly, I thought about that since yesterday, and to me it appears like, in general, that basically we can't continue to use the existing ERCs in the new address space. So things like ERC20, right? They define a very specific interface, including the exact methods that the contract basically has to have. And it is the way Solidity works right now. It hashes the exact type of variable in there, and specifically for many of these functions methods on the contract, the address, the variable type is address, right? And so like a 20-byte address. And for new tokens, you need basically a different function that takes in a 32 bytes. So this is, for example, send tokens to, right? The to address is just sent via call data, and now it's a different variable type. And so what I think has to happen is actually that we'll have to have a new type that's basically just an extension of ERC20. That would be, I don't know, ERC2000 or whatever. And that basically would have a different interface for this new 32-byte address type. But then basically what it could have is it basically could have legacy support for the old interface. So it could also implement all the old functions. But every time you call the old function, it could then basically manually go to the translation table, as long at least as the translation table is indeed accessible by contracts, and manually resolve that, right? And I think if we do this very clear separation, I think many of the problems we talked about yesterday basically go away. So basically make it always very explicit so basically like only allow, like if you deploy a new contract in the new space, always very clearly define old like legacy interface kind of methods, and then manually handle the translation there. And so at no point, just by accident, do you have the case where you're being called from the old space, but then you interpret that as like a call from the new space or something. So I think that solves a lot of these problems. I don't know though, if that makes sense.
I agree with Ansgar there. I think that we should have that we don't like. I know you're talking about manually. I'm not convinced that it really has to be that manual. I think that all that has to happen is every contract that's in the new address space has to basically define 2 entry points. It has to define an old entry point and a new entry point, depending on who calls it. And then the people who call the old entry point, but then Solidity can just like generate the shim itself, because it knows that like argument 3 of this function is an address. And so in the new interface, it makes it a long address, and in the old interface, it automatically converts it to a long address by just using the translation table.
Right.
Actually, I had a chat with Chris today, and we, I guess, initially concluded that we would want to have a new type for, I guess, long addresses. I mean, that's very much in line with what you said. I mean, this definitely helps for anything on the new space, but how is this exactly helping the legacy case, what we were discussing with the compressed addresses? I mean, that's in already existing contracts.
So in the old address, in the legacy space, so there's 2 types of calls that are hard. There's calls that go from legacy space to new space, and calls that go from new space to legacy space. For new legacy space to new space, I'm proposing that the legacy address calls the compressed address of the new contract with some like legacy function with legacy addresses in, that gets handed to the entry point for legacy code on the new address, which does whatever conversions it wants to. And this should be, I think, auto-generatable by Solidity in most cases, and then hands it off to the contract code. That's the legacy to the new address. For the new address to legacy calls, the reverse, the new address contract has to like make sure it makes a legacy call to a contract it detects as a legacy contract. So, for example, if you have like a new contract that wants to interact with an ERC20 token, it has to check whether the token it has been handed is a legacy contract or a new contract. If it's in fact a legacy contract, it then has to serialize all the call data as if it was using the legacy Solidity interface. It has to convert any long addresses it's got to into their compressed form, and it can then hand them to the legacy contract. And the legacy contract never has to know anything about these new address spaces. It is like completely oblivious.
Yeah, this is the regular cases we were happy with. But I believe the whole conversation we have about the compressed addresses is not the nice case, but the problematic case where you didn't initiate any of this properly from like a new address space to a legacy space. Rather, somehow you ended up submitting a compressed address to the legacy space. If you, as you described, if you initiate the transaction from the new address space to the legacy, I mean, that's even with the current proposal that's well covered, because on the legacy side, any opcode which returns an address would do the translation map insertion for you, and such as like origin or sender or caller. And from, I guess, the ABI standpoint, the ABI for most of the contracts already enforces a 20-byte address, and if you send more, it would just revert. So for all of these like happy cases, when you properly initiate this from the new address space to the legacy, I mean, all of this should work. But I guess what we were more concerned about is when somebody messes up.
Right, and I think like one big question there is though kind of how easy is it to basically mess up? And yesterday I was very concerned that some flows basically are really tricky to get right. But I know at least think that with very strict kind of Solidity typing inside of new contracts at least, you can make sure that you can't just kind of like accidentally point smart contracts to each other in a bad way, basically. So that all of this will just work. And so I think the only problematic case is really if incorrect address types come in from the outside via call data. So like if you call in a legacy contract and you accidentally give in like a full 32-byte long address, that's problematic. And then also if you accidentally basically give a new token or contract, for example, a compressed address from the outside as a target for send. But then I think yesterday what we talked also about was like if we even think that special purpose kind of recovery methods make sense to provide from the protocol. And I'm still of the opinion that if we can make it really kind of like very if we can ensure that this will never happen just normally, accidentally, and you basically have to actually purposefully do very weird things in order to trigger this, then I'm very happy with just not providing any explicit recovery methods for these cases.
The most likely scenario we felt could happen is like a tooling issue from the off-chain side, so like from the wallets and apps.
Right, but I mean, even there, right? Like because you have this clear typing, you'd have to send a compressed address to an explicit long address type, or you'd have to send a long address to an explicit short address type, which with this strict typing, to me, I mean, I don't know. I'm not an expert in tooling, but this seems like tooling should generally just not do that on accident.
Okay, so yeah, so I don't think it's typing related as much as opposed to how do you obtain these addresses in the first place on a wallet? And the wallet should be able to obtain the compressed address without ever, I mean, at least since the method how we calculate the compressed address is public, obviously a wallet can decide they just manually calculate it. And they don't interact with the chain for that. And if they end up manually calculating these addresses off chain, then they may as well just send it as call data. Maybe this again is just a question of education, and maybe if I mean, that's why we brought up this point that the translation map should be accessible through RPC to wallets, and maybe in that case, you know, we should really educate wallets that they shouldn't try to manually calculate any of these. Rather, they should always check if a translation exists in the map, and if it doesn't exist, they would need to do a transaction which inserts it and use the resulting compressed address. So maybe it's an educational question, but this is, I guess, the concern we had.
And am I correct? Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Peter.
So if you have a compressed address, and you're given and you're shown that this long address converts into this compressed address, you can be cryptographically confident that that compressed address actually refers to that long address in general. The one exception to that is that it is possible that the birthday attack problem applies, and that there are in fact two long addresses, both of which have been created by the same person, and that person has spent a very large amount of money to do so, that have the same compressed address. And so in most cases, if you're given a compressed address and a long address that hashes to that compressed address, you can counterfactually treat that compressed address as if it refers to that long address and be confident. If you want to be super duper confident, you need to go and do the lookup on the blockchain and find out whether someone has inserted that compressed address, that long address, into the translation table, at which point you can be confident that that compressed address for all time refers to that long address.
Maybe to clarify, I think in this discussion, my concern wasn't coming from a collision issue, rather that since you can calculate your compressed address on the wallet, and if the wallet does that, they may just interact with a legacy contract and send that compressed address in the call data without ever having populated the translation map. And if this happens, then that legacy contract will, I guess in the Ether case, we'll just create a new account. And that's what we discussed yesterday. For the token case, I suppose it's not a problem, because once you populate it, then it should work.
Right. Although, by the way, yeah, I also have I think I can come up with a scenario in which the token is also problematic. So say I want to do a swap from a legacy token to a new token using, I don't know, Uniswap or something. And I start with the, I want to, like, the ultimate recipient should be a long address, but it's not yet, it's never interacted with the legacy world, so it's not in the translation table. And so I off-chain just calculate its compressed representation, and then I go to legacy Uniswap basically and initiate the swap there with the compressed address. And then Uniswap kind of, I don't know, deducts whatever old token balance, all that works, but then Uniswap now wants to send to that compressed address, and so it kind of calls the legacy interface of the new token, and it gives it the compressed address, and then the legacy interface of the new token recognizes that this is a short address, and so it has to convert it. It goes to the translation table. However, the translation table does not know the compressed address, and so at least if we don't have like a compressed address prefix, which we just discussed earlier, the 3 bytes, so if it's not clear if this is a compressed address or just a short address, the translation table would say, I don't know this, so the kind of uncompressed representation would still be the compressed form. And so then, in a new token contract, this would still be accounted as basically belonging to this compressed address. And then it's stuck, because then we can't ever get this out. So there are scenarios in which if you just rely on it being in the translation table and it's not yet in the translation table, it can also not only can Ether be stuck forever, but also tokens can also be stuck forever, I think. So and Alex, am I correct in my understanding that this would also be solved by just if you'd also just populate the translation table from access lists every time, and so it would just be wallets would just have to, as like a best practice, they would just have to include the long address in the translation table if they want to use the compressed form in the call data, and so in that case they would ensure basically that it's in the translation table.
Yeah, well, so if we, I guess the access list is like a separate question, but even before we got to the access list part, we were considering that. I mean, basically, the cheapest you can do is just to like an X balance or something like that. Or well, the cheapest is just to do like a caller. So there could be a very simple contract on the legacy space. All of what it does, it just executes one instruction, the caller instruction, and you just call it from the legacy space, and this would populate the int state. Translation table, and basically what wallets would do is they would just create a transaction to this contract, and therefore populating the translation table. But one could also think about like having an actual interface for the translation table, just sending a transaction there. And of course, if you go the way with access list, that makes this nicer.
Right. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. But I mean, you're correct though that like, okay, I understand. I was kind of convinced that tooling, or not convinced. I thought that maybe tooling would basically have to really be voluntarily choosing to do something incorrect. But you're right that like just forgetting to do this is something that seems realistic. That it could happen. That ideally, what you should do is you should make sure the thing is in the translation table. But because most of the time it works, even if you don't do it, because most of the time it's already in the translation table anyway, some tooling, some wallets might just forget to implement this step, or just not kind of consistently always do it or something. And so we could indeed end up in situations where this misbehaves. And the question is there anything on the protocol side we can do to, well, like for example, with the sending ETH to an address, I think we can prevent this by just having this prefix for compressed addresses, and then if you ever actually send ETH to an address that with its prefix is clearly a compressed address, but it's not found in the translation table, then the transfer could just fail. Right?
So we were talking about recovery processes. I think I've thought of the right primitive. Is it possible to solve all of this with a combination of, firstly, for ETH, do some sort of merge count stuff, and for recovery of tokens, to provide the ability for accounts to impersonate their compressed address. So, for example, let's say that I had one of these ERC20 tokens. My ERC20 token had got stuck. Under my compressed address in a new long account ERC20 token but stored as the legacy version of my compressed address. In order to get out of that situation, all I would have to do is call the new ERC20 token and send a transaction to it to transfer it from my legacy compressed address to my long address. And when I did that, I would have to set a flag in the transaction that says, rather than setting message.sender to my long address, set message.sender to my compressed legacy address.
Right. I think we kind of briefly touched on that as well yesterday. I think the main problem with this is that this only works for externally owned accounts. So if you have something like a Gnosis save that you use to then interact with other dApps or whatever, and then the compressed address of this Gnosis save is the one that kind of incorrectly received funds or tokens or whatever, then you can't, like, it seems very dangerous to allow you from the outside to just basically arbitrarily set this flag for any intermediary smart contract that the transaction touches, because they can just break other interactions. You could just kind of like set that flag maliciously for contracts you don't control, kind of in a sense. And so this solution seems to only work for EOAs. And so our question basically is it worth adding this extra functionality that they can only kind of recover from these failures in the very specific EOA case? Is that a fair summary?
Yeah,
I think that's a fair summary.
I kind of also came around based on what was mentioned earlier today, that that was one of the main issues with this translation map logic in the spec, is that we have no ability to distinguish a compressed address from a short address. But hypothetically, what if we do have that ability? And this is what like this prefix discussion is somewhat about. Hypothetically, what if we do have the ability to distinguish a compressed address from a short address? If we do have that, does that mean that everything is solved? Because in that case, translation map would just say, would just return an error or something?
To me, it seems indeed like this would solve. So it seems like it would solve the immediate ether case, because the ether transfer would just fail if it understands that it should resolve the compressed address, but it can't. But it seems like it would also catch cases where at least like you're entering a new token via the legacy compatibility interface, and it understands that it should ideally resolve this address, but it's unable to because it calls the public kind of function from the translation map, and the translation map understands that it should be able to translate the thing, but it can't because it's not in the translation map, and this could also just return an error. And so these new token contracts could also just throw in this case as well. So I feel like the only case in which this would continue to be problematic indeed is if you directly send in I guess even like new token contracts could even do the same check even within their normal transfer function. So I feel like, to me it really seems like this should make it possible to write completely safe code on the new side, and the old, like the legacy side, should never have any issues to begin with because it deals with short addresses anyway. And so it never incorrectly has a compressed address because because compressed addresses are like in legacy space are always like there by design. So it feels like the new space now has a tooling for catching these mistakes, and the old space basically never will have mistakenly like have to deal with compressed addresses in the first place. So to me, first impression, this indeed solves the problem. But I could have overlooked something. I don't know. What do other people think?
Micah has a comment about contract callers like Gnosis Wallet, but I don't fully know. Yeah, Micah, is your mic just not really working due to the internet speed, or if you type it out, I can also read it up.
unless that was in reference to Peter's proposal, but I like looking at the timestamp, it looks like that was actually addressed like in reference to my comment. So just to point out though, by the way, the prefix solution has of course the one extra drawback, right? That instead of making the collision resistance or the issues for collision resistance a theoretical problem with 20 bytes, now we actually only down to 17 bytes. And I'm not an expert there, but to me it feels like that moves it from a theoretical concern to like a somewhat practical concern.
Yeah, and I think, I mean, I don't want to bring this into this call because we discuss it tomorrow, but I would combine it with kind of like the ephemeral map, because at least then you don't have the collision issue for all the in-state stuff. Rather, you have to provide these on a per transaction basis, but maybe that doesn't make any difference.
Right. Although in a sense, you could also argue it the other way around, right? Like where at least if it's in state, you detect collisions and you can at least kind of like just not allow a second entry with the same compressed address, and that throws. So you only have problems with counterfactual situations. Whereas if it's ephemeral, then you basically are unable to detect that this is kind of like an attack in a sense, and unable to kind of, yeah. So you basically, in a sense, I think the ephemeral could also weaken this. But you're completely right. We should discuss this tomorrow. So then, like, it seems like the summary here. So let me get this right. So basically, I think we seem to be in a position to say that using the prefix and also the extra logic to prevent normal addresses to ever have this prefix in the future, we would be able to distinguish between compressed addresses and normal short addresses, and that would mean that at least looks like all of the mistakes around sending things to the compressed address could be prevented. If we don't do this, we think that if all tooling and all contracts behave ideally, this should still never happen. So this is kind of like everything could be designed as to never cause this mistake, but it is easy for tooling to make mistakes because it's like on chain. You can't catch those mistakes on chain. So you basically have to rely on tooling to never make the mistake in the first place. And so if it's at all kind of realistic and feasible to go down this prefix route, it seems like the safer choice for compressed addresses.
My internet is not working, so I probably will chop up if I try to talk.
Okay. Yeah, but is that in general like a fair summary, would people say?
Yeah, I suppose as next steps, it seems that we have two different work streams. One potential stream is assuming that we solve this distinguishing compressed addresses from legacy addresses, and with that assumption, I guess just working out the entire specification and see if any of these, I guess, test cases which were listed or any of these cases we have encountered, would there be an issue in that case? And it seems like that this option would be simple enough, at least solve these problems. But then a sub work stream of this is actually figuring out what would be a good way to create compressed addresses in such a way, whether it's a prefix, then how big is the prefix, etc. And that's definitely some kind of a work appropriate for a cryptographer. And then the second quite big separate work stream is assuming that this prefix stuff or distinguishing option is not working. And in that case, we do have these 3 questions we started off with today, is what to do with like mistakes with compressed addresses. And I'm kind of leaning towards that maybe the more rational next step is choosing this first work stream and being optimistic about it, and because the number of steps seems to be smaller in that case, and maybe this is the option maybe Team Epsilon would like to explore in the next few weeks. But yeah, I wonder, how do you guys feel about this? Is this like a realistic path to at least explore? And is anybody else interested in this or the other path?
So to me, I think that kind of distinction makes sense. I am also I also think it makes sense to prioritize the optimistic case of that we are able to distinguish the compressed and the short addresses. I think, given that like we as a core team also are at least thinking of being involved and in kind of working on address space extension a bit, but I think we'd also kind of like want to kind of follow with this optimistic stream, and I think there might be like a further branching off point tomorrow. Like if we follow through with our plan of kind of talking about the ephemeral list and the access, like ephemeral translation table and the access list tomorrow, because I think at least that we might be more interested in like maybe exploring alternatives around like an expiring translation app or something there. So basically, not branch off here, kind of follow you with on the optimistic side, and then potentially maybe branch off for the last topic tomorrow. Is what my feeling is, if that makes sense. And also, it seems like at least that even in the unhappy case that we are not able to distinguish compressed and non-compressed addresses, basically the just do nothing, and if mistakes happen, too bad approach, which would just be the default, would still like be a possible path in there. That I feel like even if we end up having to default back to this, we kind of like we don't lose work, right? Because it would still work. It would just then basically we might have missed better ways of catching mistakes, but then we can always still work on that. So I feel like even if we have to default back to that case, we like all we've been doing on top of the happy case will still be valid. It might just not be quite the optimal thing to do. So I feel like, yeah, I think it makes sense to kind of focus on the happy case for now.
I guess we wanted to limit today's call to 30 minutes, and we're already like 14 over. Yeah, I wonder, Micah, if you would be able to write down maybe your concerns about this case, especially like this Gnosis wallet on maybe the address space extension channel, and yeah, maybe take it from there tomorrow. But it would be nice to really just dedicate tomorrow to the actual translation map itself. And what we want to explore is like an expiring option or an ephemeral option, or just like the fully in-state version. That seems to be like a well-contained topic for tomorrow.
Sounds good to me. And I think Micah, actually, it could be that he's just like very delayed, that his comment was actually was referencing Peter's like UA specific solution after all, because also like when you unmuted, it sounded like commented on something that was said a minute earlier. So it might be that. But I guess we can see offline about this. So then, sounds like everyone is still on board for the plan of having one last session tomorrow in this, at least in this series, and then maybe afterwards probably, maybe pick up later, but not quite in this frequency. So would we then just do tomorrow the what used to be the usual time? So like the 1 hour earlier than today. I think that's the normal slot, right? 1 hour earlier than today and scheduled for 1 hour. Would that work for everyone?
Yep, sounds good to me.
Works for me.
Okay, then let's just go for this. No need to have 10 minutes of planning at the end of every call. So if there's nothing left for today, thanks everyone for coming. Thanks Alex again for leading this, and see you all tomorrow. I'll send invites out after this call.
Thank you. See you tomorrow.